Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. Happy New Year. Welcome to 2021, which feels exactly like 2020. Today I'm going to be talking about the books that I read in the month of January. I would be super eager to hear if any of you guys had read any of these books, so if you did, leave me a comment below and let me know what you thought. The first book I'm going to talk about is called Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. It came out in 2009. I was able to track down a version from my public library, but look how beat up this copy is. I think they need to retire it. I get a kick out of that. This was a very popular book when it came out. It won the Man Booker Prize as well, and I just remember a lot of buzz around it. This book covers the period of English history from the year 1500 to 1535. So if you remember, that's essentially when Henry VIII is trying to get permission from the Catholic Church in Rome to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, who is from Spain, in order to marry Anne Boleyn. And the book is a dramatization of those events, and it's told through the life and the point of view of Thomas Cromwell. If you're British or you're familiar with British history, I think you would have heard of Thomas Cromwell before. He was fiercely loyal to his sponsor, I guess you could call him, Thomas Wolsey, who was an English archbishop, but also a Catholic cardinal because the church was all one back then. After the fall of Thomas Wolsey, Cromwell went on to become an important advisor for Henry VIII and also had his own goals and objectives around bringing about reforms that eventually led to the greater Protestant Reformation. This book is quite long and it's very thorough. So there's an enormous cast of characters who are all drawn from history, and Mantel covers a lot of different events. This is 35 years of history, and I did get kind of lost in some of that history and had to constantly refer back to the Britannica Encyclopedia or look up who certain people were. She covers all of the main political and religious figures, so people who are at court, the Duke of Norfolk, the Duke of Suffolk, obviously the Boleyn sisters, the Boleyn family. Thomas More makes a prolonged appearance. A lot of the key figures who were important in bringing about the Protestant Reformation, so like Tinsdale, who was the first person to translate the Bible into English, merchants, pretty much anyone who was a player in this period of history shows up in this book, which can be kind of overwhelming. For me, the key highlight was really how Mantel brought to life the character of Thomas Cromwell. There's not that much known about him historically, but she's able to fill in his backstory in a way that's very true, or at least nods to what we do know about him and really makes him come alive as a character. He comes from a lower class background, an abusive father, and is able to rise up to the point where he's extremely high in the political framework, and he's advising Henry VIII directly. He also has a lot of power accrued in terms of pushing for these different reforms and splitting the Church of England from the Roman Catholic Church. And I just love how she depicted him as a very cosmopolitan and hardworking person. And she really humanized him. I think he was the best example in this book of Mantel being able to make history come alive and feel very personal and forge this really strong connection between the reader and a historical figure. There is also some very gorgeous writing in this book. Mantel definitely imbues some of her insights around English culture and tradition and how everyone was kind of playing an outside game that was a bit different from who they were inside and the role of religion. But I would say in general, this is kind of a hard book to trod through just because it's very long and there are a lot of historical characters, and she kind of assumes that you're going to know who they are before you even read the book. I'm really glad I read this because this was basically a crash course in this period of history, even if it wasn't completely historically accurate, but it was not my favorite, and I think partly that's because I'm American. I think in order for this book to really grip you, which it seems to have gripped many people, you kind of have to be British. And the reason for that is I think growing up as a Brit, you'll have heard of a lot more of these characters than I have. And I will caveat that I'm pretty clueless. I was like saying to people like, what? Henry VIII had 6 wives? I had no idea. Why aren't people talking about this? And people are like, they are talking about it. There's been so many movies and TV shows made. But there's something about hearing about this history and knowing certain things your whole life. Like I think most British people always heard about the rivalry between Bloody Mary and Queen Elizabeth I, and they always heard about the Boleyns, but they probably didn't know, the timing of it or how long it actually took or who was actually involved in the different dynamics. And so when you read something like this that provides all of that background, I think that's a very winning combination that is especially compelling for someone, maybe not just British people, but I think in particular, someone who's grown up with that from a small age, but anyone who is more familiar with that history. And it's just been my observation as well that most of the people who I know who love this book are British. Someone in my book club summed it up really well. He called it the Hamilton for British people, which he was recounting his experience of watching Hamilton, an American musical, and thinking like, okay, this is fine, but like I don't get what all the buzz is. And I think the reason Hamilton did so well is because Americans have that same context of from a small age in public schools, private schools, whatever, you hear all this kind of nation-building folklore about the founding fathers, and Hamilton provides emotion and enrichment and like a different perspective of that story that you've known since you were small. And I feel like that's similar to what Wolf Hall does if you do have that historical context and those emotional ties to this story. I will give this a 3.8 out of 5. I highly recommend this for anyone who loves British history or this period of history because I think it is pretty historically accurate. Hilary Mantel did all her research and she collaborated with experts in this period of history. And it's just a fun read, I think, if you already have some additional background context. The next book I'm going to talk about is called PAP versus PAP. This is obviously the book that I read about Singapore for the month of January. It's a compilation of essays by Cherian George and Donald Low, who are both Singaporeans, but now they're academics who are working out of Hong Kong. Donald Low used to actually be the associate dean at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and Cherian George, who I've mentioned before on this channel, used to be a professor at NTU, Nanyang Technology University, and he was also a journalist at Straits Times. And so both of these individuals are kind of the leading thinkers when it comes to alternative points of view, and each had their own reasons for having to leave Singapore. This book came out very recently. It was published last year in 2020. And the main underlying premise of the book is that the PAP is here to stay, at least for another 15 years, despite recent gains from opposition parties during the most recent general election. And as a result, any reforms that we want to see in the political realm, the economic realm, are going to have to come from the PAP itself instead of from external forces. The book has 3 main sections. The first section covers the events of last year, so the general election, which happened in July 2020, and then also the government's response to the global pandemic and kind of what that means for Singapore's future and the PAP's need to reform. The second part of the book is all around mostly economic reforms that the authors think should happen. It covers like the need for a wealth tax, inequality in Singapore, and economic redistribution. And it also covers a little bit in terms of social justice issues. There's one chapter on racial groups and culture. And then the third section is all about democratic reforms, accountability, and it provides a good overview of Singapore's media system and the various ways that the PAP has rigged the political realm so that they always have the upper hand, and why it's in the PAP's interest to create a more equal and level playing field. This was a fun read just because it's so recent, and if you're not based in Singapore, you might not know, but the most recent general election was one of the most highly engaged and mesmerizing, I guess, in terms of the public attention given to it, and also younger generation and social media attention given to it of elections that have been held in Singapore. So there are a lot of like different things that happened, moves that the PAP made that I won't get into, but if you're really knee deep into Singapore politics or you live here, you'll have seen it on the news, you will have seen it on Instagram. And so it's pretty cool to have the analysis and the description of such recent events in this book. But overall, I feel that it really kind of skimmed the surface. The chapters are really short, which normally I think is great. Like, I love succinct writing, but the problem is I think the authors tried to cover too many topics, and at least for me, I would have found it a lot more compelling if they had made the whole book in support of this one main argument. Because I think on the surface, I understand you're saying the PAP needs to lead these reforms from within because they will have control for the next 10, 15 years, but that leaves me with so many questions. Why would a ruling party implement democratic reforms that would then decrease its control and its upper hand? Is it likely that they would want to do that? Like, what are the different factions within the PAP? Are people even thinking about this? Are there other examples from history or other countries where a ruling party who's been the single party for 50 years then kind of limits its own power? I just feel like there's so much more I wanted to know around whether this is likely or feasible that would have made a much stronger case and a much stronger book, I think, because unless you convince people of that main premise, the rest of the kind of other laundry list of reforms seem really out of reach. And a lot of the chapters covered topics either in a superficial way or in a way that's been done better, I would say, in other books. Like, I love Cherian George's Singapore Incomplete. I haven't read Air Conditioned Nation yet, but I will try to this year. And I just think by skimming at the surface level, you don't really get a lot of value add from this collection. If the goal is to kind of harness the attention of a younger generation and the people who are following GE 2020 really closely, and then try to convert them into more politically active citizens, maybe I can understand that's why you would provide a more superficial treatment. But especially some of the chapters by Donald Lowe, they just felt too theoretical and kind of moralizing, and didn't seem to really engage like the meat of the discussion on that topic. One idea I really did like, in addition to that main premise, which I think is fascinating, is George says a couple times that given the dominant position of the PAP, we need a party that wants to lead, not just rule. And that, I think, is something super interesting and meaty, worth unpacking, because it really frames the PAP in a way that they would almost welcome, as kind of in this special position of being able to be more bold and more creative and more innovative because they have this sustained history and trust with Singaporean citizens. But instead, sometimes they force their own errors or have own goals or whatever the appropriate sports analogy is, and they make these mistakes which are really not necessary and prove that they're more insecure and defensive and reactive than they need to be. Another idea that George brings up, which I've seen in other books as well, is that Lee Kuan Yew and the early PAP positioned their role in Singapore's nationhood so much as protection against external vulnerabilities. We're a small country, we have multiple racial groups, we do not have a hinterland, and so we need the PAP to really protect us from these inherent vulnerabilities. Whereas now Singapore has reached a level of prosperity and stability that the entire project of nation building or the imagined community that you're putting forth can't just be, we're protecting you from these bad things. It needs to be something positive. Like, we want to be a country that is fair and just, or whatever it is, or, you know, Singapore is going to be a sustainable nation. And there have been little things of little threads of this forward projection of a vision. I don't think it's fair to say the PAP doesn't do that at all, but they're not confident, I think, all the time in doing it. And that lack of confidence really came out in certain ways during the election last year. Most of this stuff in this book I already knew and was kind of a rehash, except for the last chapter, which is called Riding the Populist Tiger, which I thought was brilliant. That's probably the best chapter in this collection. And the authors are talking about how in the early days, Lee Kuan Yew, as you guys know if you've watched this channel, entered into an alliance with the left-wing students and Chinese-educated labor leaders like Lim Chin-siong in order to form government against colonial rule. And then later he turned his back on them and put them all in jail. But that initial alliance was in his favor because it allowed him to achieve certain things politically. And so he rode that tiger. He was like holding on for dear life on that tiger so that it served his end objective. The comparison here is to the rise of populism and nationalism that we've seen all throughout the world. It's also playing out in Singapore, and the more conservative elements of PAP, I guess, have been stoking that, or at least acknowledging it to a certain extent. And I think they make a good point in this essay in saying that that's really just a poison and kind of dangerous for the PAP to harness populist sentiments in any way. Even if it provides a short-term political advantage, in the long term it's going to be detrimental to overall stability and the social fabric. Finally, the last thing I'll say is I think the most eye-opening thing of last year was the treatment of migrant workers in Singapore. And maybe this was too politically sensitive of a topic to include in this volume, but I'm pretty shocked that there wasn't a whole essay dedicated to the status and the rights of migrant workers, foreign workers who are mostly in like the construction, shipping, maritime industries here in Singapore. The foreign worker dorms had the majority of the coronavirus cases that we saw in Singapore. And even today, these workers' mobility is severely restricted. So while most everyone else in Singapore has been able to go outside, live their lives, they just have to wear a mask and be in reduced gatherings, most foreign workers can only leave their dorms once a week for a few hours. And so there's really some questions there around how Singapore treats these workers. And so maybe that's just too sensitive to write about, but this is self-published and I don't think they were gonna shy away from that topic. So definitely looking forward to a very in-depth analysis of how Singapore treats this segment of its population. It seems like the perfect intersection of things that happened last year and the need for more economic and social justice in Singapore. So I just assumed it would be covered, but it's just kind of mentioned in passing. There's no chapter that's dedicated to it. So overall, I'll give this a 3.5 out of 5. I think also if this were the first book I had read about Singapore, I would have liked it better, but because I've already read a lot at this point, it kind of just skimmed the surface. I'm very okay with things that are more accessible or written in a journalistic style, but I felt like that wasn't really what this compilation accomplished. It was just kind of very short, theoretical propositions of certain things they thought should happen, along with more details and specific examples that I basically had just already heard of, already knew about. And so maybe it just wasn't the right book for me. If you have maybe only read a couple books about Singapore, or if you live here but haven't read anything, I think this would be an easy thing to pick up because it's pretty short and you can pick which chapters that you're interested in. But I would still recommend something by Cherian George over this, probably Singapore Incomplete, or even I would recommend the Naysayers Club, where you can just pick, even though that's a long book too, you can just pick out a couple of chapters and interviews that you're interested in. This, I think, is really only worth it if you got super interested in GE 2020 and you kind of want to hear about how these two folks interpreted those events. Next, I'm going to be talking about the fourth book that I read this year and last year that takes place during a global flu-like pandemic. I don't know what's going on. Trust me, this will be the last one unless something else good comes out. But anyway, it's called Ocean of Minutes. It's by Thea Lim, who is actually Singaporean Canadian. It came out in 2018. This one is a lot more plot driven and simpler to read, I think, than the other books that I've talked about so far. The basic plot is that Polly has time traveled to the future so that she can be kind of like an indentured servant to this company that's also providing the vaccinations or the treatment for this flu. And she's doing that so that her boyfriend Frank, who has the flu, can get the treatment, but Frank has to stay behind while Polly has already time traveled to the future. So the plan is they have picked a place where they're gonna meet up when Frank's timeline has finally caught up to Polly's timeline. But Polly cannot catch a break in this entire book, so I won't spoil any more of the plot, but she runs into a lot of different issues and struggles as she's trying to reunite with Frank. In my view, there's kind of two main themes that the author is trying to comment on through this premise. So the first is she's definitely critiquing the treatment of workers under capitalism, this exploitation by, the levers of power and economic production, this company that not only controls the time travel machine, but also controls the flu treatment, and also the callousness of the immigration system in the United States. This book takes place in the US, and there's a couple instances where Polly loses her status and the US has been kind of reconfigured in this dystopian future. And that just serves to really show how certain people are disenfranchised under this system that really strips them of their humanity. The second theme, I think, is more lighthearted. It's about romance and whether Frank and Polly, who are quite young but in love, can keep their relationship together even though they're apart now and they're separated by all these years and they've gone through different life experiences. And that was actually my favorite part of the book, was Lim's depiction of the early days of the relationship. The book is kind of comprised of different flashbacks, and I thought that was the most natural and organic and authentic part of the book, was when Frank and Polly are falling in love and kind of the different insecurities they have and maybe can't always express, and how that unfolds as you're starting to trust and get to know someone. The other parts of the book, which were just kind of a lot of scenes that really pointed out the unfairness of these systems, kind of felt a little forced, a bit ham-fisted. It drove the plot along, I guess, but it kind of didn't really build up to any bigger point about how Polly feels or how we should feel. It was more just one blow after another. It was a pretty depressing book to read, to be honest. And it gets kind of frustrating also how clueless Polly is sometimes. And I guess that's the point of the book, right? Which is you have to be rich or really industrious and resourceful in order to figure out all the red tape and these like very labyrinthine systems that don't give a shit about you. But it kind of was like borderline she's an idiot in some points. It's kind of like, okay, Polly, like maybe you don't deserve to be reunited with Frank if you can't like get your shit together. I think if you're looking for just kind of a short read, science fiction with a bit of love and romance in it, I would recommend this, but not highly recommend. I'll probably give it a 3.5 out of 5. The last book I'm going to be talking about is called Dead Astronauts by Jeff VanderMeer. I will be honest, I checked out this book because the cover was really pretty, and also because I have read another book by Jeff VanderMeer. I read Annihilation, which is also a movie now. That's the first book of his Southern Reach trilogy, and that book is amazing. I always meant to read the other two, but never got around to it. That was probably one of the only books that gave me literal goosebumps. Like, it was so effective in creating a physical reaction in me. It's really good. But I didn't realize that Dead Astronauts is actually book 2 of Jeff VanderMeer's Born trilogy. But this book was so weird. I had no idea what was really happening, that I don't know if it matters that I didn't read the first book. Maybe that is why I was so confused. But Jeff VanderMeer has been called a weird Thoreau. He always does kind of these books that are full of environmental horror, if that makes sense. So this book also falls within that realm for sure. There's no plot really. I guess like the main thread of a plot that I could draw out is that there's this evil company who has also been doing experiments on animals and created these like disastrous, like almost Hieronymus Bosch like creatures that are really tortured and gross looking, and has ruined like the natural earth. Like, there's a ton of environmental degradation, I guess, and it's the fault of this company who's been doing these weird experiments. Other than that, I don't really think there's a plot. It's more a collection of recurring snapshots of these different characters. So there are the 3 dead astronauts. I'm pretty sure only one of them is actually human. And then there are these like anthropomorphized animals that appear throughout. But I think the point of the book is not really to have a plot that you're following, or even some mission that the dead astronauts are trying to accomplish. It's really more to just creep you out, which I can get down with. I think like that's a fine objective for a novel. I think it's pretty successful in creating, even though it's like so random and it's really like a kaleidoscope, like you just really have no idea what's happening. It's very bizarre. Like, you can read it, and you understand the words that are on the page, but you don't understand like what's happening. And so you definitely have to be in a very like flowing state of mind to not get frustrated by that and just kind of go along for the ride. But as you're reading it, even though it's kind of just like these different shards that are well crafted, like it is very well written, I think. So even though it's so random, you do get like this solidified overall feeling of being creeped out, of the cruelty of humans, and just kind of this visceral acknowledgement of like how poorly we treat the earth and like natural things around us. So I do think that there is some sense of achievement there, that he was able to be so unconventional in the style and still kind of create something that held together, I guess. The form was also very unconventional. There was part of the book that was just 4 pages of the same phrase repeated over and over. There were some pages where there was like only text at the bottom. There's like different fonts, text that like fades away. There are some parts of the book that were versioned, like version 1.0, 1.1, 1.2. There's definitely some type of theme that I didn't fully grasp around multiverses and multiple timelines and multiple versions. Yeah, I think those are like the weirdest things in the book. And some of the really well-crafted passages really sounded like spoken word. So it's definitely a book that you experience, and he's using like these different tools to try and evoke something out of you rather than tell a story. So I'll give this a 3.5 out of 5. I want to have an open mind, and I feel like I was pretty down to just kind of experience the book, but I have no idea what it's about or like what really happened, which I think is okay sometimes. And that is it for my January books. Thank you so much for watching. If this was something that you found interesting, please consider subscribing. I also launched my blog. I'm gonna start writing up accompanying blog posts to these videos. Just in case you don't really wanna watch a whole 20 to 30-minute video, you can just read the written post and kind of get an idea of my thoughts on the books that I'm reading. Definitely let me know if you've read any of these books. Kind of the whole reason I wanted to start this channel was more to have in-person conversations about books that I'm reading. So feel free to comment me, PM me, let me know if you agreed, disagreed with my thoughts, and hope that you guys are staying safe and well, and I'll see you in the next video.